Throughout the ages, there have been great empires and civilizations that have risen up, their creators ruling nations, regions, and continents for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some of the great legacies and accomplishments of these empires may be lost in the mists of time, but from what they have left behind in rock and ruin, we can trace remarkable stories. After centuries of occupation by Romans and Moors, by the 15th century, most of Spain was a devoutly Christian country. It had produced two high Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabel, who were ambitious and powerful leaders.
When in 1493 the Pope divided the world and gave the new world, the Americas, to the Spanish, their task was to convert.
But in the process, Spain gained a reputation for a brutal inquisition and exploitation of native peoples.
There was nothing that the Spanish would have not done in order to get what they wanted.
The riches bestowed by the New World after Ferdinand and Isabel sponsored Columbus to go there would usher in a golden age for Spain, not just making it the most powerful nation in Europe, but a global superpower. It proudly called itself the Empire on which the sun never sets.
It was the first truly global trade empire that the world had ever known.
In this episode of Empire Builders, we explore how a Catholic crusade changed the world and built a mighty empire. We begin our journey in Avila, situated in the heart of ancient Spain, in the region of Castile, which, since medieval times, had developed a crusading tradition. With its imposing city walls, Avila has the most complete fortifications of any city in Spain. Work on them started in 1090, but most was carried out in the 12th century. The walls stretch for 2.5 kilometers and enclose an area of 31 hectares, and are on average 12 meters high. The fortifications include 8 monumental gates, 88 watchtowers, and more than 250 turrets. In the second half of the 15th century, the Queen of Castile was Isabel, and in 1469 she married Ferdinand, the King of neighboring Aragon. Together, these high Catholic monarchs would create a new Spanish state. They also presided over the brutal and bloody Inquisition, which persecuted Jews and Muslims and ultimately drove hundreds of thousands from this land.
When the Inquisition was brought into Spain in the 1470s, that had had to adapt to very specific contingencies in Spain, which was indeed that of a multicultural and multi-religious population, which was quite different from the rest of Europe. Was a big minority, so a strong minority of Jews and Muslims.
The Inquisition was one of the most important instruments of the state in the Spanish Empire. It was used to control the population, to enforce religious orthodoxy, and also to inspire that religious orthodoxy amongst Spaniards. They'd hold public rituals and ceremonies called autos de fe, at which the Catholic faith would be proclaimed and celebrated.
Avila tells a story of what was very much a high Catholic crusade. Isabel spent many years in the city, and together with Ferdinand, they made their summer residence a monastery, the monastery of St. Thomas. The largest of 3 cloisters here became their summer palace. Today, the other 2 remain as they were almost 500 years ago. The arches of the eerily beautiful cloisters El Silencio are decorated with the royal couple's coat of arms, those of the Dominican order who still run the monastery, and pomegranates, a sign of Isabella and Ferdinand's confidence in their forthcoming victory over the Moors, who had introduced the fruit to Spain. The royals even buried their only son here, the heir to their throne, Juan, who died just 19. The royal pews used by Catholic monarchs in the choiry remain as they were. The Grand Inquisitor, Thomas de Torquemada, is also buried here. He oversaw the building work, much of it carried out with money looted from Jews and others branded heretics. It's a common story in Avila. The city's most famous saint, Teresa, who founded the austere Carmelite order of nuns, lived for 30 years in a monastery still here today, built on a Sephardic Jewish graveyard, remnants of which have been recently uncovered and memorialized in a field right outside the walls of the monastery next door. Avila today remains true to its high Catholic roots founded in medieval times. Its glorious cathedral, one of Spain's most impressive, was first constructed in the 12th century. It is home to spectacular Renaissance art and sculpture. The cathedral was actually built into the battlements of the city. Today, those battlements still stand, grandly lit for tourists, but they remain a symbol of a warring past. By its deeds and actions, Avila was behind an imperial Spain that would take on its enemies and spread its faith far and wide. Medieval Spain was home to Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and it can still be glimpsed today in the winding alleys of the old Jewish quarters, particularly in the Andalusian cities in the south, such as Cordoba, Seville, and here in Granada, where one of Moorish Spain's most spectacular buildings, the Alhambra Palace, still stands. Work began on the Alhambra fortifications in 889. But the complex evolved over several centuries, with work on its 3 palaces not completed until the end of the 14th century.
The Alhambra was the last surviving Islamic citadel in medieval Spain. It was a huge fortress and palace on top of a hill, which took the Castilian armies centuries to conquer.
In 1492, the Emirate of Granada was the last bastion of Moorish Spain to fall to the La Reconquista, led by the crusading Isabella and Ferdinand. The last Moorish emir, Boabdil, surrendered to the Spanish monarchs on the plains below the fortress. The Alhambra itself was never taken, but the royal standard of the Catholic monarchs soon flew from the watchtower atop the fortress citadel. The Catholic monarchs then moved into what was the most exquisite of buildings that the Moors had created during their 800-year rule. The Alhambra complex is vast, covering 35 acres, and has a number of grand features. The protective Alcazaba, or fortress, at its western end, is the oldest part of the complex and built on an isolated and precipitous headland, making it impossible to take. The rest of the plateau comprises a number of earlier and later Moorish palaces, enclosed by a fortified wall and 13 defense towers. Right in the heart of the complex is the giant Renaissance palace, built by Spanish King Charles I in 1526, sitting uneasily amongst the Moorish architecture of the Alhambra. main entrance to the Alhambra was the Gate of Judgment. Built in 1348 with its massive horseshoe-shaped arch, the hand of Fatima, with fingers outstretched against the evil eye, is carved above the entrance. The royal palace complex consists of 3 main palaces. The oldest is the most modest and was used for business and administrative purposes. The Hall of the Ambassadors is the largest room and was used for welcoming important visitors. The Moors' pleasure gardens and courtyards with water features as its lifeblood add to the Alhambra's restful, exotic aura. The entire complex overlooks the old district of Abysin, where Muslims continued to live for decades after the Reconquista. Soon after the last Moors were overthrown, the Inquisition intensified, and Jews tolerated under Islam were driven out too, or killed, the victims of a bloody and barbarous witch hunt by inquisitors. Isabella and Ferdinand's lieutenant, Thomas de Torquemada, ran 100,000 trials, burnt 2,000 at the stake, and advised Ferdinand and Isabel to issue the Edict of Expulsion. This led to 100,000 Jews converting to Christianity and another 200,000 who didn't being forced to leave the country.
The Inquisition was crucial in some ways in trying to uncover the true nature of people's beliefs. And one of the reasons why the Inquisition was founded in the first place was to police the boundaries between these different ethnic populations and to ensure that religious conformity and homogeneity existed throughout the kingdoms of Spain.
The Alhambra, the most famous of Moorish palaces, may still be here today, but after the Reconquista, inquisitors tried to eradicate Muslim culture too, carrying out mass baptisms, burning Islamic books, and banning the Arabic language. By 1500, about 300,000 Muslims had been baptized and converted under threat of expulsion, but these Moriscos, as they were known, were eventually expelled 100 years later. It was deliberately symbolic that Ferdinand and Isabella chose to be buried in the city of their greatest conquest, marking total victory of the Reconquista. It was their grandson, Charles I, who ordered the construction of the giant Granada Cathedral down the hill from the Alhambra, where he intended all Hapsburg royals to be buried. Today, Isabel and Ferdinand, the architects of the Spanish Empire, dubbed the Catholic monarchs by the Pope, lie inside a chapel adorned with royal motifs, adjoining this giant cathedral. Elaborate sarcophagi conceal simple lead coffins in the crypt underneath. These high Catholic monarchs remained austere and pious to the last. Charles I, the heir to Isabel and Ferdinand's growing empire, fell in love with the Alhambra, even marrying and honeymooning here, and he continued the now established tradition by erecting buildings next to or on Muslim sites, in this case, building his Renaissance palace right in the middle of the Alhambra. He never lived here. In fact, it wasn't finished until hundreds of years later.
It was a hugely ambitious statement of a new Italian style of architecture with a big central court. It was very much of the same style as Michelangelo, but far more ambitious than anything Michelangelo had yet designed. In the 1520s, Charles V saw this palace in Granada as the potential new centre of his universal monarchy.
He also erected a new entry arch to the Alhambra, featuring his coat of arms and 3 giant pomegranates, a fruit prized by the Moors who had lived here. The Alhambra fell into disrepair for more than 2 centuries, only to be rediscovered by romantic travelers in the 19th century. It was made famous by American writer Washington Irving, who wrote about it in 1853, and he is honored here today. The practice of erecting Christian icons in Muslim buildings went back centuries, such as here in the Great Mosque of Cordoba, which was turned into a church in 1236. In fact, a whole unique style of palace architecture called muja, which blended Muslim and Christian design motifs, was developed across Spain at such places as the old Moorish Alcazar here in Seville. Seville's massive cathedral, the world's largest, is itself a former mosque. Its giant bell tower, the Giralda, used to be a minaret. The tower is 342 feet high and remains one of the most important symbols of the city, as it has been since medieval times. The Moorish Almohad dynasty built similar towers in Morocco, which served as a model for the Giralda. The tower's first two-thirds is the former minaret, built between 1184 and 1198, and the upper third, Spanish Renaissance architecture. The weather vane at the top, the Giralda, which gives its name to the building, is over 4 meters tall, 7 meters including the base. Covering the top of the tower is the lily section, which surrounds the enclosure with the bell. The statue stands 7 meters with the pedestal and has sat upon the top of the tower from its installation in 1568.
It's quite startling going into the cathedral in Seville. It still has the feeling of having been something else in the past.
After Seville was taken by the Christians in 1248, this former mosque was converted into a church, an outstanding example of the Gothic and Baroque architectural styles. An 11th century Almohad watchtower by the river Guadalquivir survives to this day, one of the only remaining Muslim buildings in Seville from the period. It was from Seville's river waterway that Columbus and other Spanish explorers and conquistadors set sail to a new world, and from where they would ultimately return with galleons laden with treasure.
The Reconquista militarized Spanish society. It created a society which was used to conflict and which was used to fighting. And the Spaniards who went over to the New World, they took many of the military techniques and the state-building techniques which had been used to incorporate the Islamic lands of medieval Spain. They took those techniques and they used them in the New World.
Spain's most infamous conquistador, Hernán Cortés, arrived at Cozumel on the Yucatan Peninsula in 1519 and in less than 2 years had defeated the Aztec Empire. Said Cortés, "We came to serve God and King, but also to get rich."
Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro are the most infamous conquistadors because they were the two men who had the very good fortune to stumble across the two largest indigenous civilizations in the Americas, the Aztecs and the Incas. Cortés was a brilliant military strategist, and one of his greatest gifts was the use of spectacular violence, the use of terror as a tactic of war. On one occasion, he received an embassy from a local group. He became aware that this local group were plotting against him, so he cut the hands off all of the emissaries who had been sent to them and sent them back to where they'd come from. Now, this is a classic example of the use of spectacular violence to terrify.
Cortés destroyed the empire of the Aztecs, renowned for its powerful military and religious institutions, with a force of just 600 men and 16 horses, taking its capital city, Tenochtitlan, after a bloody 4-month siege.
The conquistadors, when they first saw it, were utterly amazed. They compared it to Venice because of its system of canals. At that time, Tenochtitlan was one of the most populous cities on earth, and certainly it was more populous than any of the cities that the conquistadors themselves would have seen up until that point.
Tenochtitlan covered at its greatest extent some 14 square kilometers and was connected to the surrounding countryside by 3 causeways. The city itself was laid out in a grid pattern, with many canals permeating through the city. At the heart of the city was a large sacred precinct, dominated by the huge pyramid, known as the Temple Mayor. On top of the 60-meter-high pyramid platform reached by 2 flights of steps were 2 twin temples. The north side shrine was dedicated to Tulok, the god of rain, and the other, on the south side, was dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. The Temple of Tulok marked the summer solstice, symbolic of the wet season, whilst Huitzilopochtli marked the winter solstice, symbolic of the dry season and a time for warfare. The monumental steps leading to Tulok's temple were painted blue and white, the former color representing water, the element so strongly associated with the god. In contrast, the steps leading to Huitzilopochtli's temple were painted bright red to symbolize blood and war. Sacrifices, including human ones, were carried out at both temples to feed and honor the gods. A typical sacrifice involved the victim having their heart ripped out, being skinned, decapitated, and then dismembered. Following all that, the corpse was flung down the steps of the pyramid to land at the base. All this ended with the arrival of Cortés on the scene in 1519 and his encounter with the Aztec king Montezuma.
Cortés kidnaps Moctezuma, he keeps him under armed guard and tries to use him as a puppet ruler to control what was an empire of millions of subjects. He was assisted in his conquest of the Mexica or Aztec Empire by a very, very large number of indigenous allies. And then Cortés' strategy was very much a divide and rule strategy. By allying himself with the enemies of the Mexica, he was able to call then upon tens of thousands of indigenous allies to help him and assist him when it came to armed confrontations with the armies of Moctezuma. The death of Moctezuma, following his kidnapping and captivity by Cortés' men, left the Mexica Empire headless.
The site of Tenochtitlan, now Mexico City, continues to be excavated and has yielded some of the greatest treasures of Aztec art and that of the other great pre-Hispanic civilizations in Mesoamerica. The Metropolitan Cathedral of the Assumption of the Most Blessed Virgin Mary into Heaven is the largest cathedral in the Americas and seat of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Mexico. The cathedral was built in sections around the original church that was constructed soon after the Spanish conquest of Tenochtitlan, drawing inspiration from Gothic cathedrals in Spain. The conquistadors decided to build the original church right on top of the site of the Aztecs' Temple Mayor, using the actual stones from the destroyed Aztec temples.
The cathedral in Mexico City was one of the most important symbolic buildings that the Spanish ever built in the Americas. And it was a very defiant statement that we're here and we are now in charge. And our God is better than your God.
The natives of Mexico were soon overwhelmed and intoxicated by a virtual feast of the senses, unleashed by powerful Catholic rituals in these new citadels of religion, erected by their conquerors: music, mass, incense, chanting, and art.
One of the ways in which the Spanish attempted to draw the indigenous people in, persuade them to convert to Catholicism, was through these magnificent buildings and through this kind of feast of the senses, through music, through singing, through altarpieces, through sculpture, and of course through the sense of smell, through the burning of incense.
After the conquest of Mexico, rumors of golden cities motivated several other expeditions. Many of those returned without having found their gold or finding it much less valuable than hoped. But in 1532, another conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, set off from Panama and discovered an empire that equaled the Aztecs in its riches. The Inca were originally a mountain tribe that since the 10th century had begun conquering and absorbing their neighbors. But their weapons of war, sling, mace and shield, would be no match for the guns of the Spaniards. The Inca, by the time the Spaniards arrived, ruled large parts of Peru, Chile, and Ecuador, and had created an elaborate society of complex customs and deities, in addition to a warrior ethic. But Pizarro had overthrown the Inca Empire less than 2 years after first encountering it.
Pizarro very much, I think, imitates and copies Cortés. They both employ quite similar tactics when they encounter these great civilizations. They both insist on having direct kind of personal communication with the leaders of those civilizations.
The Inca Empire began to fall apart in Cajamarca, a small mountain city snuggled deep in the Andes, tucked away in the northwest of Peru. It's around 9,000 feet above sea level and has a population of around 250,000 people. Today, life revolves around the bustling daily market that spreads across a few streets in the center. People come from the surrounding villages to sell their food. What seems to set the people apart is their hats. The villagers wear different styles of hats to denote which village they're from. As the Spaniards discovered, the Inca cultivated the potato, as they still do today. It is now, of course, one of the world's most popular vegetables. It's said that the great Inca king Atahualpa invited Pizarro and his men into the town center to meet him. When he arrived, the city was empty. Atahualpa's army was camped in the hills around the town, and the king himself was taking a bath nearby. Then as now, Cajamarca was known for its soothing mineral waters and hot springs. On that fateful day in 1531, when Atahualpa had finished bathing, he set off to meet Pizarro. Atahualpa was very certain that his army of over 20,000 soldiers camped outside the city could easily outnumber Pizarro's measly handful, so much so that he took just a few thousand of his army and nobles unarmed into the city square. Pizarro had his men hide in buildings around the square, with their horses waiting silently, hoping not to be discovered. Pizarro sent a priest to negotiate, but then attacked the Inca, bursting out from hiding places. Firing all the cannon and the few muskets they had, they fought their way to Atahualpa, who was being carried by servants on a litter. They snatched the Inca king and took him into custody, right under the noses of thousands of Inca warriors. Atahualpa offered a ransom to gain his release, promising to fill what is now known as the ransom room with gold. 3 months later, when the ransom room was full of gold, instead of being released as promised, Atahualpa was garroted and burnt in front of his people in the city square. With this execution, the Inca Empire began to crumble, to be replaced by Spanish rule. Further Spanish settlements were progressively established in the New World. New Granada, modern-day Colombia, in the 1530s. Lima, in 1535, was the capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru. Buenos Aires in 1536 and Santiago in 1541. Florida was colonized in 1565 with the founding of St. Augustine.
The Spanish Empire is effectively an empire of cities, of great cities. They do not exert direct control over very large swathes of the territory and very large numbers of the indigenous population. So the empire itself is run by a relatively small number of Spaniards in these kind of in the kind of continent of the Americas. Perhaps as few as 100,000 Spaniards have travelled to there across the whole of the 16th century.
The Castilian Empire abroad was initially a disappointment, but it soon became apparent the massive wealth it could generate. Foods such as tomatoes, potatoes, spices such as chilies, vanilla, rubber, and the brilliant red cochineal pigment harvested from the plant by the Aztecs, which changed the color red across the world.
The arrival of Europeans in the Americas completely transformed the entire, completely transformed the Western world in terms of its diet, in terms of its habits.
The Spanish Empire boomed in the 1520s with a large-scale extraction of silver from the rich deposits of Mexico's Guanajuato region. But it was the opening of the silver mines in Mexico's Zacatecas and Potosi in Upper Peru, modern-day Bolivia, in 1546 that changed everything. By the late 16th century, silver from the Americas accounted for 1/5 of Spain's total budget, while the conquered tribes of Latin America were put to work in the mines. It's estimated 95% of the indigenous population of Latin America was dead within 2 centuries of colonization.
Of course, the labor they used, the workforce, was indigenous people. And once those indigenous people died of being overworked or diseased, which of course was carried by the Spanish from Europe and decimated the population in a very short amount of time, then labor was taken from Africa. This is the very beginning of slave trade.
Miners worked from dawn till dusk. The average working life was just 6 years. The Spanish created vast fortress complexes in the New World in coastal locations like Cartagena in Colombia and Portobello in Panama. Mule trains would make their way overland to deposit gold and silver from the mines, but also silk and spices that had been landed at Acapulco on Mexico's west coast after making their way across the Pacific from Spain's new Asian colony, the Philippines. Once a year, 2 galleon fleets would arrive to take these riches back to Spain across the Atlantic. One would head for Cartagena, the other for Portobello. The galleon was a large multi-decked sailing ship used as an armed cargo carrier. It was powered entirely by wind, using sails carried on 3 or 4 masts. Some of these galleons could reach up to 2,000 tons in weight and carry more than 300 guns. Constructed of oak, they were designed to spend long periods at sea. Protecting these treasure ships was a job in itself. The Spanish created a network of forts on the coastlines in their possessions across the Caribbean, in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Florida, to guard against pirate attack. At the head of this global empire in the 16th century were the Hapsburg kings. Charles I was a grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand, but he was also by now Holy Roman Emperor, anointed by the Pope as King of Christians, and known in Europe as Charles V, overseeing a vast swathe of European possessions.
Charles I is one of the luckiest men who ever lived, inheriting not just Spain and Castile and Aragon, but of course the Low Countries, Burgundy, southern Italy, Sicily, and then of course after 1492, the small foothold that the Spanish established in the Caribbean.
Charles V was a hugely important figure in the development of the Spanish Empire. It was during his reign that the empire first started to take shape, and he was the king who, more than anyone, realized the importance that these new territories would have for Spain.
During the 16th century, Spain held the equivalent of $1.5 trillion in gold and silver received from New Spain. The royal palace in Madrid, built on the site like so many palaces in Spain of an old Moorish alcazar back in the 14th century, underwent a significant upgrade. The palace has since undergone many more renovations over the centuries, particularly after extensive damage caused by at least 2 fires. Charles I was the first to begin renovations, and these were continued by Philip II when he moved his court here in 1561. Rebuilt by the Bourbon kings, it took on the appearance of French palaces, but it remains the largest royal palace by area in Europe. One of Charles I's greatest triumphs in Europe was the defeat of the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Lepanto in 1522, which effectively put an end to Ottoman hopes for a conquest of Europe. The Hapsburgs pursued several political goals: access to the resources of the Americas, gold, silver, sugar, and products of Asia, porcelain, spices, and silk, undermining the power of France and containing it in its eastern borders. And maintaining Habsburg hegemony in the Holy Roman Empire by defending the Roman Catholic Church as the true church against the Protestant schism. It also focused on defending Europe against Islam, notably the Ottoman Empire, and spreading Catholic Christianity to the unconverted souls of the New World. Charles' son was Philip II, and in 1585 he built a massive austere monastery and palace at El Escorial, about 30 miles from Madrid. Like his great-grandparents, Isabella and Ferdinand, Philip was a fervent Catholic, but to many, he was a zealot. El Escorial was to become a pious monument to Habsburg monarchy and dynasty.
Philip II was the most pious of all the Spanish monarchs, and that piety is most visibly represented in the building of the Escorial, a huge monastery which Philip built as a centre for the monarchy and as a symbol of his private devotion.
Spanish conquests through the ages were celebrated in the extraordinary Hall of Battles, and kings and queens would be interred in an underground vault, the pantheon of monarchs, along with those royals that died young. The library at El Escorial showcased Spanish triumphs and knowledge on a global scale. Philip was a workaholic control freak, and his rule was generally seen as successful. The Philippines was named after him, although it was he who sent the Spanish Armada on an ill-conceived, overzealous mission to invade England to turn it Catholic. Philip's son, Philip III, was generally regarded as one of the worst and laziest kings in history. It was he who expelled 300,000 Moriscos from Spain in 1609, a decision ultimately seen as self-harming to Spain and the empire. Moors who had converted to Christianity were seen as the enemy within. Philip III's son, Philip IV, is associated with the Spanish Golden Age, primarily because of his patronage to Diego Velázquez, the greatest ever Spanish painter. Philip IV, along with Charles I of England and Louis XIV of France, was one of the greatest royal patrons of art and artists. But during the reign of Philip IV, the empire was already in decline. The transatlantic trade had in fact peaked back in 1609.
Philip IV's reign saw the first significant weakening of the Spanish Empire, with an acceptance that the Netherlands wouldn't return to Spanish rule, and also in 1640 the loss of Portugal, which once again became an independent kingdom.
The Dutch and the English are very strong. They go for the Spice Islands, they go for the Persian Gulf, and the Iberian Empire, by then known as an Iberian Empire because of course Philip II had become King of Portugal. is not able to defend it anymore. This is an empire which was alone in its enterprises just a few decades before.
Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the galleon trade went on. As to the treasure, it was brought here to the Archivo de Indias, where it was both stored and counted. Nowadays, the building houses 5 miles of shelves containing 80 million documents, the records of 400 years of Spanish conquest of the Americas, and the portraits of those that played a key role in colonizing and exploiting the New World. Throughout its American colonies of New Spain, the Catholic mission to convert the Native Americans continued. In Latin America today, the missions they created, like this Jesuit mission in Trinidad in Paraguay, lie in ruins. While many of the 18 missions the clergy established in California alone have been restored.
Many Spanish clergy sincerely believed that it was their duty and even their destiny to convert all the native peoples that they found in the New World to Christianity. Some of them believed that this was a necessary thing in order to bring about the second coming of Jesus Christ. Others thought that converting the natives to Christianity was the only means of legitimizing the Spanish presence in the Americas.
The fortresses offer them, a space of refuge when indigenous Spanish relations turn ugly, when they get nasty. They can retreat back inside the fortresses. The misiones themselves are predominantly settlements. They're small towns built on a kind of Spanish model with a typical plaza in the central square, with the church, the kind of most important houses and residences around that square. And the misiones are in large parts of the empire. I mean, particularly we're talking about, North America and California, for example, northern Mexico. They're an attempt to persuade the indigenous peoples to become settled, to become farmers, rather than to go on being nomadic.
Aged and sick priests who helped convert the natives of the New World to Christianity were often housed on their return to Seville, here in beautiful surroundings in retirement hospices, such as this one, which celebrated the triumphs of the Christian faith. In 1648, plague devastated Seville, a catastrophe from which it never really recovered. With the river Guadalquivir silting up, a decision was made to move the trading base with the New World here to Cadiz. Cadiz had always been an important port city for Spain. Columbus embarked on 2 of his 4 voyages from here. Seville's woes would usher in a golden age for the port city, and the wealth it created can still be witnessed in its grand buildings and homes. It's a legacy still acknowledged in the city today. But although Cadiz, like Seville, would enjoy the benefits of being the clearinghouse for goods from the New World, the reality was that by the late 17th century, Spain's empire was in decline. The rot had really begun to set in for Spain's Hapsburg dynasty with the coming of the childless Charles II, Philip IV's son.
The whole story of the decline of the Spanish Empire is very closely wrapped up with the decline of the Hapsburg dynasty. The problem with the Hapsburg dynasty is that they didn't like outsiders. They didn't like marrying outside the family.
Charles' ancestors included Joanna the Mad, the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, and Charles' parents, Philip and Mariana, were actually his uncle and niece.
He was always a sickly and disabled man who was incapable of having children, and for most of the final decades of the 17th century, Everybody knew that this great era of Spanish history was coming to an end, and the important question was, who would take over when Charles died?
The infertile Charles didn't learn to speak until the age of 4, nor to walk until 8. His jaw was so badly deformed, an extreme example of the so-called Hapsburg jaw, that he could barely speak or chew. He didn't attend school or clean himself. Toward the end of his life, he demanded that the bodies of his family be exhumed so he could look upon the corpses. Charles said physicians attending him was always on the verge of death, but repeatedly baffled Christendom by continuing to live.
After Charles II's death, Spain was plunged into a war of succession, and the eventual victor was Philip V, a grandson of Louis XIV of France, who brought Spain into the orbit of France for the first time and transformed what had been a great rivalry in the 16th and 17th centuries into one of the important alliances of the 18th and 19th centuries.
A new Bourbon king, the son of Philip V, was Charles III, who tried to resurrect an ailing empire, but the war over the Spanish succession, which had displaced the Spanish Habsburgs, had weakened Spain. The peace treaty even led to Britain gaining the Rock of Gibraltar, which it still holds today.
From the mid-17th century on, Britain began to self-consciously compete and try to take parts of the Spanish Empire away from Spain.
With the Napoleonic Wars and Napoleon's occupation of Spain, the Bourbon kings of Spain found an unlikely ally in the British, who under the Duke of Wellington occupied Spain to drive out Napoleon's forces.
The fundamental moment of decline is when you have both French and English, French and British land invasions of the Iberian Peninsula itself. You have the presence of foreign armies on Spanish soil, and that really, of course, is the death knell of, Spain's greatness as a world power.
When U.S. forces under Andrew Jackson invaded in 1816, the Spanish gave up one of their most valuable possessions. Then, one by one, Spain's colonies won their independence.
Florida was a Spanish colony for over 300 years. We've been a part of the United States for less than 200 years. The history of this state or colony goes back 500 years in written history. And we were Spanish much longer than we have been American. In 1816 to 1821, Spain regarded Florida as something of a burden around its neck. It was expensive, there was no great commerce coming out of here. It was all sandy beaches, who would ever want that? And so Spain gave it up. The demise of the Spanish Empire began here. That agreement with the United States to give away Florida in exchange for being able to keep Texas really opened the door to the revolutions in Mexico, in Texas, and the dominoes fell all the way down through South America.
The Spanish Empire never really recovered from Napoleon. And in the early 19th century, many of Spain's imperial territories declared their independence.
Spain's empire created dozens of Latin American cities, the identity and character of which remain unmistakably Spanish and thrive today. San Jose in Puerto Rico, Antigua in Guatemala, Havana and Trinidad in Cuba, Quito in Ecuador, Lima in Peru, Santiago in Chile, Mexico City in Mexico, Buenos Aires in Argentina, and just across the border, Montevideo in Uruguay.
The most important legacy of the Spanish Empire is that Spanish is a global language. There are millions and millions and millions of people throughout the Americas who speak Spanish. And Spanish culture is visible everywhere, from California down to Patagonia.
By the second half of the 19th century, only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, and various territories in Africa, were still under Spanish rule. Following the Spanish-American War of 1898, Spain ceded its last colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific to the United States.
Eventually, Spain as a kind of state becomes exhausted. It simply cannot put together the resources of men and money that it needs to sustain a global empire.
With this, Cadiz, the last Spanish city to benefit from empire, fell into decline, becoming a virtual backwater.
An empire is bad in the way that it destroys. When to create your own churches, your own religion, it means to destroy that of the people who lived there before. It was easier for other empires coming after the Spanish to act in a way which would have been considered better, especially because they could compare themselves and say, look, we're not as bad as the Spanish. England, France, the Dutch, they wanted to have a say in the new world. And the easy way for them was to say the Spanish are treating the indigenous people so badly that we should go and do something better.
Spain's empire was a brutal empire, but it was a successful empire. Spain's empire has a reputation as having been a very bloody empire and a very exploitative empire, and at least in part, that reputation is justified. But Spain's empire was also one of the most important links in the story of globalization, which has taken place in the past 500 years. The Spaniards were the first to link the Americas back to Europe and to Eurasia. The Spaniards were the first to create a truly global political and economic system on which all subsequent empires, including the British and the American, have built.
The Spanish boasted that theirs was an empire on which the sun would never set. But like all empires, the sun did set, not just into the sea of Cadiz Harbour, but across the country.